morning, everyone, and welcome. It's such a huge privilege to be here today at InvoCAD 4.0, surrounded by individuals who have dedicated their lives to shifting power, fostering agency, and reimagining development from the ground up. So today's Chopal, Leading from Within, Communities as Architects of Change, is about a fundamental shift in how we think about development, moving from a model where communities are seen as beneficiaries to one where they're the leaders and decision makers of their own futures. So why does this conversation matter? Across India, we've seen a lot of top-down interventions. These are well-intended, of course, but they often fail to create meaningful, deep, lasting change. Instead, it's the voices, the leadership, and the solutions emerging from within these communities that have proven to be the most sustainable and the most powerful. Whether it's the Mahila Samakya programs, redefining rural governance, farmers organizing producer collectives, solar energy solutions, or the dignity-first approach of organizations like Gunj. So what is the common thread here? The common thread here is agency. But we also know that agency is constrained by a number of aspects or factors. Funding models, power imbalances. So what are the key questions before us today? What does it take to truly shift power from institutions to communities? How do we ensure that communities are not just participants, but co-creators and decision makers? What are the systemic mindset shifts that are needed to look at the way we approach development? To unpack these critical questions, we have today's Chopal. Here we'll discuss grassroots leadership, power shifts, and most importantly, cross-sector collaboration. So to explore these themes, we are joined by a very distinguished panel of change makers, leaders who have actively redefined the role of community agency in their fields. Welcome, a warm welcome to the panel. But this is also a Chopal, so it's also all about us in this room. Many of you here today are activists, policy makers, change makers, educators, social entrepreneurs. You have seen firsthand how it is to build agency within communities. So we encourage you, the audience, to be an active part of this Chopal. Listen, question, ask. There'll be a lot of opportunities for you to ask questions during this session. So think what resonates within you and feel free to ask. So this is a space for collective learning. So we've all been talking about the power of collective action since yesterday. So if we are talking about shifting power, that also includes sharing the stage with you all. Please do ask questions to all our panelists. So what do we hope to leave today with? Our goal is not just to discuss ideas, but also to challenge the deeply ingrained assumptions about how change happens. So how do we move from designing solutions for communities to co-creating them with communities? What are the concrete shifts we need in policy, funding models, and mindsets to ensure that the agency is the focus of development? We have outstanding speakers with us today. So let us begin this conversation by hearing from them about what they have learned, what still needs to change, and how can we move forward together. We'll start with you, Kameshwari ji. So the Mahila Samakya has been at the forefront of, putting women as the agency of development. So can you please share with us some inspiring and striking stories?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this Chopal. Closer? Okay. I must say, there was a very personal and selfish reason for having accepted the invitation. Because there are a lot of my colleagues, Mahila Samakya colleagues from Bihar, who are present, and I think who are also partnering with Shiksha Lokam. So I was keen to meet them. I don't get to travel to Bihar too much. And there are many lessons that we have learned actually from Bihar itself. There are many stories to tell, which I will not attempt at all because I think I could take up the next year to tell you those stories. But just keeping in mind the questions that you had raised in terms of collective power, agency at the grassroots, and how does it manifest itself? How does it represent itself? How does it claim the space and the power for itself? I'd like to just give you a couple of examples, and then maybe during the course of the conversation come up with many more ideas and suggestions, because some of, the Mahila Samakhya program started when most of you in this room were not born, which is in 1986-87. It stemmed out of the then new education policy of 1986. It has had a very, very long history. It has had a very long checkered history in many ways. But what is interesting about this particular program is that it worked in very, very different geographies and terrains of the country. So we were there in Assam, and we were also there in Kerala. And so we were in about 11 to 12 states across the country. And what was interesting about this particular program was that unlike most other women's development programs, which were located in the departments of women's welfare or child welfare, that this was located in the Ministry of Education. And I think that is a very important point to be noted as to why was it located within the Ministry of Education. And I think the juncture or the conjuncture at which point this program got conceptualized is also a little bit of history that you need to know, that the late 70s and the 80s were actually very, very exciting times in the country, where people were rethinking, reimagining what development could be, what is happening within the country. And as far as women are concerned, because I've been working mainly with women and girls, there was a report which talked about how, saying post-independent, nothing much has happened. We are exactly where we are. The problems continue, so what is it that we can do? So there were a group of women of which I was not a part. I was not in that first cohort. I was in Hyderabad, where they decided they needed a program which is loose, open-ended, letting women decide what it is that they want to do. Like this morning during the course of, I think, one of the talks, they said, how do local issues get highlighted? How do local issues get addressed? And that's precisely what was being done, except in this case, the focus was women. And you're talking about I think, I don't want to get too much into it. And so, we went into this whole concept of, we were very fortunate. We had excellent donors who didn't ask too many questions. There were no, log frames to be filled. You didn't need to report on any data. So data is something that you generated. We were very fortunate for about 25 years when the wheel turned after that. But the question was, what exactly happened? What is it that happened? So essentially, the program took its idea of the Sangh collective, of the Sangha, which is actually a very, very old Buddhist notion of the community as the central point, recognizing that women need to be together to be able to do anything at all. And how did that start off? It started off by just getting women together, just to sing a song, maybe share a roti, just do nothing, actually. Stretch your legs. And from there, it evolved into many, many things. And very gradually, this concept of what is the collective started taking shape. And initially, it was at a village level. And over the years, I think within about 7 to 8 years of this village-focused collectives, there was a recognition and there was a demand from the women saying that we are not interested in being confined to the village alone. Our problems cannot be solved at the village level alone because the resources and the decisions are being taken elsewhere. So in the case of most of these states where we worked, it was the block. So essentially what we learned from this is, for those of us who were working along with the women, is I think our notion of the collective itself needs to change. That's one. We'll talk about it during the course of the other conversation. I'll come back to that. But there was another question. How does a group of women, most of them illiterate, never stepped out, basically agricultural labor, never questioned, never raised their voice, how can they engage with institutions such as the panchayat, institutions such as the block level officers, and in some cases, the district magistrate. And I want to give you an example from Assam, which is an interesting example. Assam came into the Mahila Samakhya fold much later. So you already had a body of experience on which the program built itself. So there was a case in which the state had talked about the kind of services and entitlements that were being extended to women and girls. So at that time, Bihar already had a federation, but they were in the process of forming these federations. They decided that they were going to do a survey themselves. There had no concept of a survey. There had no concept of what they were going to do. But in any case, they were clear. We want to know what's happening. What is it that we are supposed to get as women and girls? So, they did an excellent survey. They could have given any Nielsen a run for their money. And what is interesting is what they did with their data. Obviously, the women did not know what to do with it, which is where I think the concept of the partnership comes. That between the collective and facilitating organizations like Shiksha Lokam or all of us who worked at different points in time, in enabling a kind of a technical way of looking at these things. They developed what is called as a data exhibition. So this data exhibition was, put up in various block headquarters. Anybody could come and watch. The fallout of it was most interesting. At that time, a planning commission member was in Assam looking at some planning commission program and happened to be in this particular block. So the member looked at it and said, obviously took some notes, I guess, and went back to the district magistrate and said, hey, look, you're claiming this, but there are this bunch of women who have presented a case in which say none of your services are reaching these 100 or 150 villages. Now, this was an excellent example of how a voice from the ground could reach a level which compelled actually that particular DM. I mean, he was furious, of course, but compelled that particular DM to re-look at what was happening in terms of services and entitlements. I mean, this is an excellent example that I've given you, but we've got a million examples of how these voices or these agencies worked. Just to leave you with 3 words. I think we didn't start with it. We learned as we went along. There were 3 ideas that drove the program. That is basically enabling voice, building capacity, and again, enabling agency. These were the 3 ideas that really were at the basis of all the work that took place in Mahila Samakhya.
Thank you so much, Kameshwari ji. As they say, you empower one woman, you empower the entire world. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Dr. Harish, help us understand how does agency-first innovation look like in practice? It would be great to hear a personal story, if there is one, of how the community challenged your assumptions about sustainable energy or design.
Thanks for inviting me here. The question about, because we all live in this world of English jargon words of sustainability, mitigation, adaptation, community ownership, etc. I think these are all English jargon. And even Angshan was speaking about, when we speak about conflict of interest, if anybody could explain how we could explain in Hindi what conflict of interest means, right? Can I go to a farmer and speak about what this is a conflict of interest? You can't, or in Kannada, you can't hire your brother because it's a conflict of interest, right? So my question is, we are stuck into the semantics, and more we are getting stuck into, right? So the whole patronizing of community is actually increasing, in fact, right? And rather than, why should we even name the concept of community? That means it's them and us, which itself scares me sometimes, right? Voices of, so that itself means that you can't have you're breaking the barriers of partnership, right? I go to anywhere. I mean, which community do all of us belong to? Is it 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 100 kilometers, right? And what is that, right? As long as we are very inclusive in our thought process and how do we actually make sure that everybody of us are able to understand a certain problem statement and come up with a solution that is through a partnership perspective. So many a time the education that we all go through, and especially English-based education, is some of the biggest barriers of that social change and culture, right? And even understanding levels and thinking. So when we started in '94, the whole definition I think that's why I think the education of IIT where I went to was most useless. And then you realize that how it's a most useless stuff, which is where the assumptions is not because you're not able to understand the community that, or anywhere else, you're not taught that inclusivity at all. And that is the biggest barrier. And for us, it's education. So simple thing like two things. For example, Biren Singh in Manipur, how he changed a four-limb motion silk weaving machine to a one-limb motion, right? He previously used to have both hands and both legs, and he converted into one, right? And then we also trivialize it by saying jugaad, right? It's not jugaad, it's innovation of the truest sense. And secondly, in Puttur, when one person wanted a 3-light system, and then when he saw the cost of a 3-light solar system, which was very expensive, what he said, no, wait, let me go. He went to the top of the roof and broke the top of the roof and put a light. He said, I don't need light in 3 rooms, I need light in, he needed lighting in 3 rooms, right? So one light was enough to put 3 lights. So how do you bring in design thinking? So the poor are already experts of systems thinking, right? So my question is, the hierarchy is, how do we learn from them, or how do we understand from them? It also comes from the basis that they are below us, which is where the problem lies today. Should we hear from them? The very fact is we should hear from the community itself is a hierarchical statement. That means we will come up with a final solution, right? How do we break that partnership, and how do we break that hierarchy? And existing education system will not allow that. So how do we, is the challenge that we all have in front of us. Yeah.
Thank you so much for pointing that out, very pertinent. And Shuji, Goonj has built an entire model on dignity first, where members lead their own change. So members are their own creators. So please share a powerful story where the community took charge of its own transformation, you know, in a way that challenged traditional development narratives.
No, I mean, our work of last 26 years must have thousands of stories, because that's the only thing we do, right? We never go and say that a village should have a road to start with. And who are we to talk about any need or want or all that? And fundamentally, I am even against the concept of, very beautiful concept here for centuries, which talks about we want to give the fish or we want to teach the fishing. That itself is such flawed, because that's again a power structure where I'm thinking that I can give fish or I can teach fish. They don't need bloody fish, you know, very simple, or they know how to do it. Are we really just taking them along, and again they become the decision maker? Without, you know, when I'm saying they means wherever we are going and talking about it. So a lot of people know Goonj about, I mean, people think that we are in the business of collecting and distributing clothes. I mean, that's what the market perception is. Although it's a hardcore rural development concept, it's a parallel economy concept, where we are treating the urban wastage as a new currency for the people, right? I mean, people are earning in kind. Now, I'll give you a very simple story, and this is something last month only when Harish organized a conference, I was sharing the same, but that's a very powerful, I'm repeating it here. That you go to a village, people take you, down, they show you a river. And that's a river which only flows in monsoon. Right? It's a Barsati river, as we say. There's a hand pump there. You come back and you say, okay, bataiye kya karna hai, what shall we do together and all that. They say we need a well. And you argue, no, but there is a hand pump next to the river. It's a water catchment area. It never dries. it's a small village. All those arguments, because, again, I'm coming from a good institute, not IIT, but it's still so-called good institute. And then you argue, and we say, no, it's a water catchment area, so the hand pump will never dry, and all that kind of thing. They say, nahi. So this old man is listening to you, and then he says, nahi, tum to beta bilkul theek keh rahe ho, you're absolutely right. Nal to nahi सूखता है, it never dries. लेकिन जब नदी चढ़ जाती है, हम तो नल तक ही नहीं पहुंच पाते. We're not able to reach that hand pump. So all your theories of water catchment and everything fails miserably. Then we say, then why? But well, we have never done that. जैसे नहीं करेंगे, we should do this. तो मैंने ऐसे ही उनसे पूछा, मैंने कहा, बाबा, have you ever done this? Any well in the village? He says, देखो, see that, it's a well where there's no water. They dug it about 150 feet, but they didn't get water. Very scary. Then I asked him that, okay, fine, but why do you think? And when the water didn't come there, why do you think that we will be able to make it? The guy says, in Hindi he says, उन्होंने हमारी सुनी नहीं. Okay? They didn't listen to us. So I asked them, what do you want to say? He says, I'll tell you where is water. And then they ask for a coconut. They roam around in a particular area. In a situation, this coconut actually changes the position in his hand. And people like us laugh. Because anything, the person who is not wearing good clothes, and that good cloth also will be decided by me. What is good cloth? Whatever they do is superstition. Whatever we do is innovation. I mean, I'm also so against this work, jugaad. I mean, if a failed experiment happened in an IIT, in the lab, that itself is called an innovation. And people who are doing hundreds of things, I mean, in Indian way, the farmers have come out with 8,000, 10,000, 20,000 different variety of rice, and we're still calling farmer unskilled. See, this is where the problem is. So anyway, this guy roams around, the coconut changes position, I laugh, but then I decide no, and he says, yahan pani hai, here is water. So then you decide, okay, fine, this is my arrogance maybe which is stopping me, because 40 people of the village are ready to believe in him and ready to risk their life or whatever, and he is ready to risk his life because if the water doesn't come, he is in a problem. And you'll not believe we dug it and we got water in 18 feet. Just 50 meters, 50 feet away from there was no water. Out there it was 18 feet. Since then we are digging well all across the country. We are using coconut. Okay. We can always argue, sitting in these fancy places about the wisdom and the science. We will never accept that if the science is not able to prove something, that is not unscientific. The time will come. Number one. The second thing is that in India, if you see the past, almost every village used to have a well. There were no machines. There was wisdom. Not everyone can do that, but there is wisdom, there is calculation, there is no superstition at all. Fine. What is the relationship between the water inside the coconut and water below the earth? That's not my problem, because ultimately the well is dug. It's important to give the power, or not actually give the power in the hands of people, rather just go as powerless. And say that, I mean, I come from a family of IITians, some 22 pass outs of IIT Roorkee in my entire family, my last generation. This generation is a baggy, it started with me, but the earlier generation. I don't know whether they ever learned how to dig a well. Right? I mean, in a village, if the people can make a circular well with the rectangular brick, how do you call them unskilled? It's very simple. So I think it's just that you have to surrender. Whatever we were able to do, despite not knowing anything about anything to do with village infrastructure, water, pond, bamboo bridge, is just because we surrendered and we listened.
Thank you so much, Anshuji. Keeping my eye on the clock and a lot more questions to ask and a lot more insights for the audience here. I'll move on to Reshma ji. Reshma ji, have you seen successful models where philanthropy and communities co-invest, where both share risk and accountability? And if you can throw light on some of them.
This can be a question that can be answered very quickly, which is rarely. But I'd like to probably start with an experience that I had that made me fundamentally challenge, assumptions and this completely, useless belief that we had, that, we know how to solve a problem. So I'm a rolling stone. I've spent a decade of my life in the private sector, then a decade of my life working in and leading nonprofits, and now a decade in foundations. So please take everything that I say with a pinch of salt. I may actually not know what I'm, talking about, but this is really out of life experiences as well. So a couple of years ago, we as a foundation head, we were chasing a partner. We were literally chasing them, saying, we want to have a conversation, aapse baat karni hai, aapse milna hai. And the founder of the organization said finally, ki haan, aap ja sakti hai field mein, my community leaders will take care of you. And so I was a little nonplussed, क्योंकि आदत है कि you will have a meeting or सब present करेंगे. So she was very dismissive कि भाई आप जाइए and you will be taken care of. So anyway, it was in Marathwada, a region also that had seen a lot of distress and farmer suicides. We go in the field, and from literally the first minute, we have women who are community leaders who basically took over the day and a half and completely dispelled all the kind of classic, assumptions that you tend to make when you're trying to solve for a big problem. So for example, their model of mitigating agricultural distress was to grow 16 crops on a small plot of land. And one would argue, how can you grow 16 crops, right? And it goes down to community wisdom, because they understood what needed to grow when, in which part of the field. This one can say, okay, fine, this is, you can solve for it. They were also very savvy in terms of handling the issue of land ownership for women, because they negotiated with their husbands that we will only do this and we will get trained if you give us, a cent of your land in our name, right? And for decades we've been battling, on this sticky issue of land ownership for women. These community leaders had figured out a solve for it as well. And the more we spoke to them in terms of their political participation, many of them have actually graduated to being panchayat leaders. Now the interesting thing is that if you'd approach this as a funder wanting to do, let's say, a water project or an agricultural project, you would miss all of this, right? Because you're so focused on, I have a thematic problem, let me go and solve for it. Anshu brought up the notion on water. Water historically in India has been governed collectively by communities. There have always been community governance models. In Tamil Nadu, I remember there's a person called the Neer Katti who makes sure that water goes equitably into people's lands. There's no government intervening on the water distribution system. She or he also paid in kind, so there's no cash transaction. Very mindful as to whose land needs, water, and how do you have to manage with what you have. And I think this is the challenge of our urban thinking, upbringing, and what we may qualify as our, pedigreed education. We just don't have the mind frames to understand and to also appreciate the way a large part of this country, particularly in rural India, has very strong, community norms and practices. We don't know them, and we need to have the humility to understand that we don't know. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers in this pursuit of collective action, right? Everybody thinks it's some new, concept in town. It's not. It's as deep and historic as perhaps we are as a nation. And that, I think, is the most important aspect. So what if it was the norm? Today it is seen as a really cool, interesting way to work. But what if you just made it that this is the way things will happen? There is no other alternative to it. And I think that is when the provocation will land particularly in philanthropy. And I think that there's a lot of learning that has to happen. That humility that even Anshu referred to is very critical, because you cannot step in. I mean, my former board, while might have asked me for numbers and all, the board meetings would open up with, how many days have you spent in the field? It was not how much
Very
money you
important.
have deployed. It said, how much time have you spent and what have you learned? And it was really interesting, because you would think that, why are you asking me? I'm like, but every board meeting opened up with, आपने दिन कितने spend किए हैं? और आप क्या सीख के आई हैं? And how is that, now reflecting in the work that you're doing? And the more we were challenged, the more we discovered that solutions lie not in our offices, not in our PowerPoint decks for sure, but with communities. And particularly even in difficult areas like building a well or building a pond or building a water structure, communities have stepped up in cash, in kind, and in governance on all three fronts. So there's enough evidence. I just think we're not looking at it because it does not conform with the way we believe change happens or the way things work.
Thank you. Sandhya ji, government programs often operate at scale, but struggle with deep community ownership, right? So can you give an example of a policy or an initiative where community participation changed the course of implementation?
Yeah.
And in the same vein, if we could also speak about how fostering multi-sector collaboration works.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Rekha, and happy Women's Day, everyone. Really very happy to be here and share my experiences of about, say, 35 years in government as well as in NGO sector and with development organizations. Yes, there's many challenges within the government when we think of how do we facilitate, how do we have this kind of collaborations. One, government is not designed to really, it's too structured. It's both a regulator, it's a policy maker, as well as a service provider. But I think information asymmetry and leadership issues, all these really are challenges. But I think over the years, over the decades, I have definitely seen a significant shift from the old MyBAP culture kind of thing to actually involving communities in both designing as well as implementing and monitoring. I can think of two, several in my experience, but there are 2-3 stories I'd like to share. I think this was when I was working in rural development. We actually did what's called participatory identification of poor in about 40,000 habitations in combined Andhra Pradesh. And there were about 8,000 resource persons who have actually been trained by NGOs. They're both from government, from NGO sector. This was completely alternative to the normal BPL survey we do, that is below poverty line survey. There's a standard survey tool and we do. But we actually sat with the communities and said, who are the poor people in your village? And this kind of an exercise happened across the state. And the government actually decided that whoever got identified as poor, and they defined, in some villages, if you had a scooter, you're not poor. But in some villages, if you didn't have a shack, you're very poor. So they divided the communities between poorest of the poor and poor. So the program focus was actually on poorest of the poor, and we could design interventions like that. Even the huge SHG movement in this country, it all started as a small pilot in the 1990s by Mairada and CARE. Some of you may be familiar with this. But see the scale at which it is now. And it's completely, I believe, shaped by the community experience and their leadership in many ways. Currently, we are talking about 1.5 crore, that's 15 million self-help groups. We're talking about 50 billion money that's funds that's being circulated, either as own savings or as credit from the banks. And more than 150 million women across the country are members. These are big figures, but the community has been a major player in this. Women self-help groups, and it changed the way banking is done in this country. They are in fact the major borrowers and savers for the banks. And it has changed the way government policies are being designed for rural sector and also urban sector. So I could think of these two as a very major ways. But coming to school education, very recently I'd like to share an example of how the program design itself changed with the involvement of community. This is school management committees and particularly parents committees in Andhra Pradesh state. Normally, when you're doing infrastructure improvement for schools, it's a very contractor-driven and an engineering department-driven kind of an initiative. But this model in the last 5-6 years made a huge difference in Andhra Pradesh, where the parents committee, as technical support in terms of estimates, designing was done by engineers, but the whole construction, repairs, local purchases, everything was done by the school management, or rather parents committees. And you could see it normally, as we say in all constructions, if 1 crore is allocated to a particular school, maybe they'll get a benefit of about 45 to 55 lakhs. Rest of it all goes in GSTs, local leakages and commissions for different levels, contractors' profit. But in this case, it was found that 95% went in actually getting this work completed. And around 8,000 crores was spent in a 16,000 crore project. And purely because local communities took interest in this and they got involved, they became the purchase committees, they supervised the work. So I think it is possible and we can design. In terms of how government can play a role, to answer your second question, in a country like ours, government is a major player. All we agree, whatever doubts we have in government, whatever misconceptions we may have, and there are all kinds of officers and bureaucrats within the system. But I think when a government can play a very key and a facilitating role, the outcomes are entirely different. Again, I'll share one simple example. There is something called TSIG, Telangana Social Initiatives Group. I don't know, some of you may have heard about it. It actually is a platform set up by the government where around 500 corporates are members. It's more to channel the CSR support that comes into Telangana state. And there are a lot of NGOs, more than 300-400 NGOs, which are registered on the platform. And there is an exchange, there are occasions created for sharing information and ideas and projects and how they mutually support each other. And majorly, the last one I want to say is, in India today, particularly in school education, there's so many organizations like Shiksha Lokam, MV Foundation in all the child labor work they did, or CSF, Central Square Foundation, and many others. For time constraint, I'm not mentioning, who actually collaborate, who are actually shaping policies, the foundation literacy and numeracy policy designing, the early childhood education initiatives and focus that's coming out into education. So I think there's a lot more collaborative work currently happening with a large section of communities and multi-sectors than earlier, individual philanthropies including. So I think it's good time this time.
Thank you, Sandhya ji. Power of
and as she was
collaboration.
saying, there's no other way but collaboration,
Yeah.
frankly. Yeah.
Yeah. This question I leave to any of the panelists to take. So what prevents grassroots solutions from scaling without losing their community-driven essence? So is scale always the goal? So can't we just think about local solutions be more transformative than large-scale interventions? Any of us?
I can add one line.
Yeah.
What stops is us, people sitting here. Because otherwise it's happening. And instead of just looking at that and then trying to find it or calling it or naming it Jugaad, if we try to just learn from one part and then, because we have that power. I mean, Last time also I was saying that anyone who is sitting on a working day in a conference has a lot of power. So all of us have a lot of power that way.
Yes.
It's just that we are not doing it. Because they're doing at their own space. Right? Look at, I was just, before coming here, I was in Begusarai and that Kosi belt, some of the area of Kosi belt. And people are so now, unfortunately, but they've made some kind of, structures that they can live, say, outside the water for 9 months or 10 months and somehow leave those spaces for 2 months and all that. Right? They've created a structure for so many of us to learn from there that how do you survive? Because you will not leave your land because it is flooded for 2 months. For 10 months, you still want to be back there. Okay? But we have the power. We need to learn from there. And then we need to see that every community, we don't have to go and innovate new things. Okay? These are already innovations.
I'm going to add another dimension to it, which is patience. When you talk about, for example, even the women collectives movement, it started in the late 1970s. The 1970s is when the UN declared it as the decade for women. And that's the first forays that happened in India. It started with organizations like Seva and Pradhan. But it's taken 50 years for the level of near universal, collectivization of women in India. Now, one can argue that in the 1980s, was the government thinking of, scale? Were NGOs? We were not thinking about scale at that point, right? So I think that one of the important aspects is to recognize that, urgency to act is important, but change may not happen in the frame of 5 years, 3 years, whatever may be the kind of very artificial impositions of time that we have put on ourselves. Because just look at the amount of progress. India's unprecedented in not just the scale of near universalization of women collectives at the population denominator that we have, but we also have an unprecedented number of women at the front line, right? And whatever way you look at it, some says 12 million, some estimates say 17 million. But just the number of women grassroots leaders at the front lines also is unprecedented. Again, something that has not happened overnight. So, and I think that is really where we trip up, because we believe that we will be able to solve for it in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. But there is a beauty in an organic journey as well that has principles that will, that are very open to going viral over a period of time. And can we make our peace with it as well?
Yeah. I'd just like to share our learnings from recent conversations over the last 7, 8 years, going back to the field, to the same field where, I had worked 30 years ago. And just sitting and listening to seeing what is it that the women are thinking, where do they think they're going, and what has changed in their lives. A lot has changed. I think a lot of our colleagues are talking about it, and a lot also has not changed. And I think if you're working in the area of gender, and you're talking in terms of changing of attitudes and biases and discriminations and so on, a lot has not changed. And as I was coming here today, I got a message from a friend of mine saying that the Secretary General of the UN has declared that, the UN is committed to gender equality. Now, I thought that UN was always committed to gender equality, but today there is a declaration. But what was interesting in listening to all the women that we met, and we met them not in all the 11 states we had worked earlier, was 2 things. One, they believed that their lives have changed because of how they've struggled at their own level to change things for themselves and for their daughters, and the implications it had for their immediate family or their community as they saw it. I think, the word community itself is a bit of a misnomer. I think it's highly problematic. This is not the forum, but we need to be aware that there are communities within communities, as it were, and which get excluded as you go down, as you describe them further and further. The question which they raised was saying that we have come this far with our ability, our knowledge, our skills and resources. but we need to go somewhere else. They're very clear. And why is it that you're not helping us reach that forum, which is basically a platform like this? Why is it that, we need help to build partnerships? We don't have the language, we don't have the idiom, we don't have the platform to be able to take these voices and our experience to higher levels. And I think, a small effort was made. It's not as if efforts have not been made in the country. They have been made. But it has always been, as our colleagues here have said, that we also need to bring grassroots voices to national platforms. Now, what the women were telling us is, you don't need to bring our voices. We'll bring our own voice. But you enable the platform. And that is where I think the problem lies. And I just want to go back to, I've also worked like Sandhya a lot in the area of education. What they were talking about now is that there needs to be a renewed effort again in the country. In the story, these little children had performed for us, saying that don't talk about primary and elementary education. Now talk about the push for secondary or higher secondary education, which is where really all the barriers are coming. If girls are surviving, they're doing quite well. It's the poor boys who are being, dropped out and dropping out and so on. So it's a different kind of challenge and question that's coming up. So they raised the question, I remember in Karimnagar where I had went, saying, why are you not back in our villages talking to the community about secondary education, which you did for 20 years on primary education? So I think they recognize their potential and their strength. They also recognize the need for the partnerships that we are all talking in terms of. And as he said, the problem is our inability to conceptualize the partnership of equality. We still want to control. We still want to direct. We believe we know. And I think there is a problem.
Thank you. Sandhya, would you like to add to that? Because she also spoke about education.
Coming from government, whenever partners come and say we'd like to try a POC or a pilot, as a district collector, one will think, when will I make a difference in the district? I'm here barely for 2 years. It has to be done at scale. If you go and meet a commissioner or a secretary, they will say, I have the whole state, I need to make a difference now in the next 2-3 years. Give me a model, give me something that works, that can be implemented at scale. So obviously this intensity, this quality, attention to detail that happens at the pilot level or the POC level doesn't. But we have to recognize the reality, and the need is now. The crisis is now. So collaborating, I'll give one example. This is some years ago, maybe about 15 years ago when we were working. MV Foundation had defined what child labor is in Andhra Pradesh, and policy decision was any child out of school is child labor. So it really needed the whole school machinery, the whole women and child welfare department, whole labor department, all of them to come together and see that all out of school children are back in schools, going through bridge schools. So the state, the community, the members of the NGOs, they all rose together and worked. So while there is a lot of value in trying pilots and doing intense work, we also need to keep in terms of how do we actually scale it and design the guidelines and the collaborative mechanisms to achieve the scale. And that's not too much time is there. We'll already lost 70 years.
Thank you. I think we have time for one question before we ask the audience. I would like Anshu to speak about your experience as a social entrepreneur, and we have not touched much about funding so far. What has helped funders and investors become comfortable with, I'm sorry, Dr. Harish, I'm sorry, we've not let him speak so much. What has helped funders and investors become comfortable with open-ended, non-linear change?
See, I mean, it's related to the previous question of scale itself, because just to continue from there and then add to the answer what you're saying. See, scale is also kind of coming from the mindset that we already have a solution, right? Which is standardized for everybody else, right? And in the present way of the California model or the IT model, that we have a product and let's scale it up, right? What we need to do is how do you scale processes, right? The Pythagoras theorem is scaled up. You use it for a bridge, you use it for a road, you use it for something else, right? But the Lego pieces need to be put up, and then I can use Lego piece number 4, 7, 8 to build my whatever I have to build, and somebody else uses 2, 4, and 8, right? But we don't teach people there are 20 Lego pieces, but we show them this is the only way these 20 Lego pieces can be used. And now how do I scale up the 20 Lego pieces, right? That's the problem. We don't scale processes. And we scale products and solutions. Like we say solar water pumping. Can we scale solar water pumping? What is the actual problem statement? Is irrigation, not solar water pumping. Today when people talk about battery, what do you call it as EVs, electric vehicles, the problem is transportation. Why are we jumping on scaling electric vehicles, right? What is the actual problem statement? Is going from A to B. Should people be going from A to B? Should I get service B to A?
Mobility.
Right, rather than saying that how do I scale up electric vehicles, that you're only helping the electric vehicle companies, not the transportation system, right? Same philanthropic model today and philanthropy, everything else is based on PowerPoint, Excel and Word. It's not inclusive. A Hindi speaker will never get the money, or a Kannada speaker, right? So what inclusivity are we talking about? What community? Ultimately, we are all middlemen here. Until that disappears, the true one will not happen, right? So the question in genuinity of philanthropy also wants this metrics. This M&E is another bogus, right? The monitoring evaluation of what? Moment you use monitoring and evaluation, that means you are creating a hierarchy. I'm going to monitor you, I'm going to evaluate you, right? On what basis, right? That philanthropy should be just like this one thing I would like from the private sector. When you do equity investment into a company, you basically look at the team, do a due diligence, they are good enough to do this work, I put in money. Whatever you do, you do. I think the same thing should happen in philanthropy. More than 2 pages of proposal is useless, right? Trust the management, they know the best, don't micromanage, put in all is the process going ahead? Is that process replicable for others to learn from? But it's getting so restrictive, and the worst is CSR, which is March 31st dependent, not development dependent, right? Until we change that mind process, how will we talk about any change on the ground? And that needs to reverse in many ways.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We invite questions from the audience. We have around 10 minutes. Request you to kindly keep your questions brief so that the panelists have more time to answer.
Hello, I'm Subir. Question to all panelists. Do you think it's time for a donor education program? Isn't that what is getting in the way a lot?
For sure, but before that, I think we need to demolish the definition of donor and beneficiary. Okay? I mean, I've been asking this question that if I give time, I am a donor, but when the community gives time, how come they are beneficiaries? Okay? If I put in my skill, I am a donor. They put in their skill, they are beneficiaries. If I give money, I am a donor. They make a bamboo bridge, they bring bamboo. They are still beneficiaries. So I think first of important part is that hierarchy, that thought process, that needs to be demolished, number one. Number two, what just Harish said, is very important for the people to understand the purpose and do not just spend so much of time, money, energy and waste the time of the development sector practitioners especially who are needed in the field, in the processes. I mean, we work extensively on disasters, fine? And disaster happened today, then the due diligence starts, and after 2 months of due diligence, you are also treated as a vendor because there's only a vendor registration form. And then the money comes for the material which is not needed. That need of that maybe rice is over. So this has to be, I mean, we need to understand in this entire process, and absolutely whether you call it donor, information or learning or whatever we call, but it's extremely important for all of us to sit on the table and understand the larger purpose and how do we speed up, because time is important in all these things.
as the lone, whatever, funder representative on this panel, may I just bring in an additional perspective? And what worries me as well, that this us and them is now very sharply defined between funders and partners as well. And this is damaging. This is an extremely damaging, dynamic. One of the key things that we often ask our partners is, how many times are we just interacting without a transaction as the purpose of it, right? How do we treat each other as peers? Because partnerships and collaboratives and collective action cannot happen if there is a fundamental, inherent, assumed power hierarchy. Whatever we may say, it is not going to happen. And to also, in many ways, test your assumptions about the assumptions that you're making about any philanthropic partner in terms of what they know, what they don't know, how they approach their worldview, etc. And to look at it as a learning journey together. Because again, to assume that everyone has a perspective to offer which could be helpful, useful, is a good place to start. And we may still have disagreements, or we may not, align on a certain, set of parameters, but that's okay. I think I am deeply concerned now with the fact that we're creating good actors, bad actors, and we keep moving, in this framing. If we were to look at it in the spirit of allyship, partnership, can we actually have conversations around, this is something that we've done which is very interesting, let's talk about it. And I've been in like 3 very diverse, foundations and philanthropic entities, the private sector, a foreign foundation, an Indian foundation. And I think one of the most interesting aspects that I have noticed was the hunger to know more. Maybe time is a scarcity, etc. We can, that may be a challenge, but there is a hunger to know more. And there is also, which is a good thing for many of us in this room, the pressure to deploy as well. So how do you take that as an advantage? We talk so much about power, and in, conferences and meetings after meetings, I also see a lot of organizations voluntarily giving up their power, right? The power that they have to think imaginatively about a problem, to be bold as well, right? So I do feel that we have to check ourselves when we start creating this them and us, because if we truly believe that we're all partners and it will take all of us, the state, organizations, foundations, collectives, institutions, panchayats, then we have to treat that everyone has something that is positive to contribute and to build relationships. This is something that has always amazed me. That we don't spend enough time investing in relationships because that is where trust builds. When trust happens, this idea that I will not hold you hostage to reporting 20 metrics, which is a different conversation for another day. I often call it the tyranny of metrics that, has taken over the sector. But the key thing is to actually look at, we're all people. At the end of the day, there was a sense of shared purpose or something that drove us to be in these spaces. That's probably the common ground that we hold. Are we willing to really understand each other as people and build those relationships of trust? That's fundamental before we start seeing partnerships that are fruitful, collective action that will work. We're all the same in that sense, right? We're saying we should treat communities as our allies, partners, peers. I feel we need to first start with funders and non-profits and community-based organizations and even government, right? Can we first start there?
Thank you. Please.
I'm Sangeeta Purushothaman, and this is to take the whole issue of grassroots women's agency and voice at different levels as a question forward. Yeah. So The largest question here is all of us here, including Kameshri, Best Practices Foundation, Nirantar, all the women here from Bihar, and 20 plus organizations, grassroots organizations, have built a national alliance, right? And we are finding that it's really difficult in this political environment to work together because CSR funding does not allow us to sub-grant. So we can't sub-grant to any of the other organizations here in the alliance. I'm just trying to apply for a massive grant on community resilience. And again, I'm finding I can't sub-grant. That's an FCRA grant. So both ways, we are finding it difficult to build the alliance in India. Now, I'm part of a global space where I'm seeing the African alliance explode. They're growing. Kenya's funding Uganda, Uganda's funding Zimbabwe. They're all raising the funds. They're able to bring this together. Same thing with Latin America. Asia is stuck, you know?
I'm sorry to interject. Can you
So that's
please
the
ask
question.
your question because we're really short of time.
So that's the question. Yeah, the question is how do we ally in this political space? Right? How do we build these alliances for Asia, for India in this political space? To Ford, to the government, this is the question.
If it's okay with you, I could actually share offline examples of how organizations are actually building and supporting their networks in sectors other than the women's rights movement. There may be some interesting parallels for you to draw from there. I think that a lot of organizations have had to pivot on their resourcing model. So resourcing not for themselves, but resourcing for the field. And there are some really powerful ways in which organizations in India have done that effectively. Interestingly, they're not all in the gender space, but maybe there's something to learn from them. So I'd be happy to connect you to a few as well.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
So we're all talking about, you know, the community and empowerment and agency within the community. But when we talk about education, it's, first of all, it's a right. Now, it's a right-based system that we're working in. And the aspiration is for all people to get into a institutionalized, structured education system, right? So are we really dealing with community here, or are we dealing with the institutional space here, right? And what does community mean when we're talking about education in a rights-based system? Because we are not directly talking about the education being available within the community or innovating within the community. There are teachers, there is a system, and that is what people aspire to get into that system for a better life and to be educated. And that, to me, is the, you know, is the dilemma here. All the examples were of, you know, water, infrastructure, even in the school buildings, but not about the pedagogy and the education.
I'm really
Sandhya ji will
glad.
take
Can I take that?
Sure.
I'm really glad that you raised this. In fact, when I was going through the note for the thing, communities are different within the school, structured school system. I'm really glad you raised that. It's true, in a very institutionalized setup that we have, there are stakeholders, so to say, outside the school system. They're not really outside, they're part of the school system, but probably most disempowered of the school system. They're teachers, they're headmasters, they're administrators. This is where the information asymmetry comes. And actually, in my view, the student should be at the center. But many times in the way this delivery happens, particularly in government systems, the teacher is the center. And the teacher service conditions, teacher recruitments and teacher training, all these kind of day-to-day issues that kind of absorb the education department are these issues, or even construction or infrastructure, or ensuring midday meal is served properly. From the government perspective, I'm talking about. But for the community that we were interacting with, really student learning outcome is a major issue. They have been saying that what is coming out of these public schools, and we are pushing children from grade to grade, but they're not really having the grade level learnings. And for the point Commissioner was mentioning about secondary level, in fact, it's really concern is the dropout of boys is more than girls. Her study also brings that out very clearly. Are we really aware of that? How are we talking to the community to address those issues? I agree with you that there are a lot more dialogue that needs to happen. But the positive side is there are quite a few organizations that are working with communities. I can tell about one. In tribal areas in Andhra Pradesh, they have something called Chaduvula Pandaga, which means it's a festival of learning. One day in a month, facilitated by the NGO, parents actually spend time in the school. And that's when the children are demonstrating what they have learned, teachers are explaining it's a different kind of a PTA, so to say. Similarly, even in Anganwadi centers, every fortnight there's something called Mother's Engagement, Mother's Day. And that's when actually mothers spend a lot of time, or a parent spends a lot of time in Anganwadi center really understanding. But yes, it's a one-on and occasional, in terms of quality, if you can mention, but there's a lot that needs to be done here. I fully agree with you.
Thank you so much. We have absolutely run out of time. So thank you so much. This has been such a meaningful conversation. We have heard real stories of challenges, resilience, and what it takes to shift power to communities. So as we leave today, I want to ask, what's the one thing you can do in your own space to ensure communities have the voice, the resources, and the decision-making power that they deserve? Because that's where real change begins. Thank you. Thank you so much to this amazing panel. Thank you. Let's reflect, retrospect on what we have heard and learned today. Happy Women's Day, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.